There was something about the way Max looked at you. Not like other dogs, no. Max had those deep, amber eyes that seemed to understand more than any human ever could. He wasn't just a dog. He was a quiet guardian, a loyal shadow, a living heartbeat at his owner's feet. Max was a golden retriever, 4 years old. Big, fluffy, playful, but calm. He loved belly rubs, hated vacuum cleaners, and had a strange obsession with stealing socks. But most of all, he loved his human, an elderly man named George. George lived alone in a modest home on the outskirts of town, a retired schoolteacher. Widowed. His children had grown and moved away. The house echoed with silence, except for Max's footsteps and his soft, contented breathing at night. They met by chance. George had no intention of adopting a dog. But when he visited the shelter one rainy afternoon, just to take a look, Max walked right up to him, sat down, and didn't move. As if he knew. As if he chose George. And from that moment, everything changed. They became inseparable. Morning walks in the park, long naps in the sunroom, evenings spent watching old movies together. George even read aloud to Max from his favorite books. Max would tilt his head, ears perked up, as if he truly understood. Their bond was unspoken but unbreakable. He brought the light back into my life, George once told a neighbor. I don't think I realized how lonely I'd become until Max walked in and made me feel whole again. There were hundreds of moments, small, beautiful, quiet moments, that made their life together special. The way Max would press his nose into George's hand when he felt anxious. The way he'd sit beside him during thunderstorms, never flinching. The way he greeted George at the door every single time like it had been a lifetime since they last saw each other. He was a dog. But more than that, he was family. And then, one quiet night, that all-consuming bond would be tested in a way neither of them could have imagined. George didn't just care for Max, he depended on him. At his age, with creaky knees and a heart that sometimes fluttered the wrong way, George had grown to rely on the quiet rhythm of their days. Max made everything easier and lighter. Max had an uncanny sense for emotion. If George had a hard day, missed a step, forgot a name, stared a little too long at a photo, Max was always there. He'd nudge George with his nose, tail gently wagging, as if saying, "I'm here. It's okay." It was more than companionship. It was understanding. And the neighbors? They all knew Max. Kids would wave when he passed by, and he'd wag his tail politely. Mrs. Reynolds from across the street always had a biscuit waiting. Even the mailman, a man notoriously wary of dogs, would pause to scratch Max behind the ears. He had that effect on people. A soft presence that made you feel safe, seen, loved. George often joked that Max had a better social life than he did. Their home reflected their bond. Photos of Max on the mantle, his toys scattered around the living room, a dog bed in almost every room, just in case he wanted to nap somewhere new. And every night, without fail, Max would curl up right beside George's bed. Not on it, beside it. Guarding. Listening. Waiting. There was a moment, about a week before everything changed, when George stood in the kitchen, watching Max chew lazily on a toy. He smiled and said aloud, "You know, Max, I don't know what I'd do without you." Max looked up, wagged his tail once, and went back to chewing. If only George had known, he was about to find out. Because soon, Max wouldn't just be a companion. He would become a savior. A quiet night was coming, just like any other. And yet, not like any other at all. On some days, George would sit on the porch with Max and talk to him like he was an old friend. Not just commands or praise, real conversations. He'd talk about his late wife, about memories from teaching, about the world that seemed to move too fast these days. Max would listen, tilting his head now and then, as if he understood every word. And in a way, maybe he did. There was a stillness in their shared moments. No rush. No noise. Just the comforting presence of a friend who asked for nothing but love. Max didn't care about George's wrinkles or his forgetfulness. To Max, George was perfect. That's the thing about dogs. They don't measure your worth the way people do. They don't judge. They don't hold grudges. They love fully, immediately, and without condition. It was in that quiet life, simple, gentle, and full of love, that their story found its true beauty. But it was also in that quiet that something dangerous would one day creep in. Unnoticed. Unwelcome. And when it came, only one heart would be brave enough to fight the fire. It was late. The kind of night where the world feels still. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the moon cast silver light across the backyard. Inside, George was getting ready for bed. Same as always. He brushed his teeth, checked that the back door was locked, set his old alarm clock. Max was already curled up in his usual spot, just beside the bed, not on it. That was his place. Always had been. George turned off the light, pulled the blanket to his chin, and let out a tired sigh. "Good night, boy," he mumbled. Max's tail thumped once on the floor. Silence. For a while, everything seemed normal. Peaceful, even. But then, George was pulled from his sleep by something unusual. A sound. A low, soft whimper. At first, he thought he was dreaming. Then it came again. More urgent. "Max," he whispered in the dark. The dog was up, standing, staring at the bedroom door. Ears alert, tail stiff, nose twitching. Then Max growled. Low and steady. George sat up slowly, confused. "What is it, boy?" Max didn't wait. He ran to the door, turned around, barked once, loud, and scratched at the wood. George swung his legs over the bed, now wide awake. Max had never acted like this before. Not once. He opened the bedroom door and immediately he smelled it. Smoke. Thick, bitter, choking smoke. His eyes stung. His heart pounded. "The kitchen," he whispered. "Oh my God." Flames hadn't reached the hallway yet, but the air was hot, unforgiving. George stumbled forward, coughing, but Max ran past him, not away from the fire, toward it, toward the danger. Then he stopped, turned back, and barked again. George hesitated. "Max, no. Come back." But Max barked once more, louder this time. And then, something in George clicked. Max wasn't panicking. He was guiding. And George followed. They moved together through the hallway, smoke growing thicker. Max stayed just ahead, looking back every few steps. He led George around the worst of the flames, through the back hallway, toward the mudroom that led outside. George's chest burned. His knees nearly gave out. But Max didn't stop. And when they reached the door, Max jumped at it with both paws. George threw it open. Fresh air rushed in like a miracle. He collapsed just outside on the steps, coughing violently. Max stayed beside him, whining softly, licking his face. They made it. They were alive. The next morning, the sun rose quietly over the neighborhood. Smoke still lingered in the air, clinging to the clothesline and curling along the edges of the blackened house. George sat on the back porch of his neighbor's home, wrapped in a thick blanket, staring at what used to be his kitchen window. There was barely anything left. Charred beams, melted wires, ash everywhere. But it wasn't the house that consumed his thoughts. It was Max, lying calmly beside him, head resting on George's worn slipper, eyes half closed from exhaustion. George reached down and stroked the dog's head, slowly. "You saved me, boy," he whispered, voice cracking. "I don't even know how to thank you." He'd told the firefighters everything. How Max had woken him. How he barked. How he led him through the smoke. How he refused to leave his side. They listened, at first nodding politely, until one of them, a young woman with soot-streaked cheeks, knelt beside Max and said, "We don't see this often. Most dogs panic. This one didn't. This one knew what to do." The chief had called him a miracle in fur. The story spread fast. By noon, a local news van was parked across the street. Cameramen adjusted their angles. Reporters rehearsed their lines. Microphones were pushed toward George's face. But George didn't care about any of it. He just wanted people to understand what Max had done. He told the story again and again, how Max refused to give up, how he pushed forward even as flames danced on the walls, how his barking brought George back from confusion, how his loyalty saved a life. And every time he told it, he ended the same way. "I owe him everything." Neighbors brought blankets, casseroles, and kind words. Some came just to meet Max. They bent down and scratched behind his ears, whispering things like, "You're a real hero, aren't you, buddy?" And Max, as always, wagged his tail and leaned in gently. By evening, someone started a fundraiser to help George rebuild. And right in the middle of the donation page was a photo. Max, standing proud, stood on his fur, nose smudged black from smoke, but eyes still shining. A reporter from the city came the next day. Bigger camera, bigger voice. She asked George, "Do you think he understood what was happening?" George paused, looked at Max, and said, "I don't just think he knew. I think he made a choice. He could have run, but he stayed. For me." That night, George and Max stayed at a friend's guest room. It wasn't home, but it was warm and safe. George laid out a thick quilt on the floor. Max curled up instantly. Then, with a quiet grunt, he stood back up, walked to George's bed, and laid beside it. Same spot, Same routine. Because some things don't change, even after the world burns. George smiled, eyes wet. You're something else, Max. In the days that followed, Max received more attention than he ever had. The vet gave him a full checkup. Lungs clear, paws a little singed, but healing. People sent him treats, toys, even a small silver medal engraved with the words, "Local Hero." George placed it gently on Max's collar, whispering, "You earned this." But it wasn't the praise that mattered. Not to Max. All he wanted was to be near his person, to sit beside him on the porch, to nap at his feet, to feel his hand on his head. And George? He realized something deeper. It wasn't just that Max saved him from fire. Max had saved him long before that night. When grief was too heavy, when silence was too loud, when the world felt empty, Max had walked in, wagged his tail, and filled that emptiness with love. That's the thing about dogs. They don't save you just once. They do it every day, in 100 quiet ways. With every tail wag, every look, every moment they choose to stay. And as George sat beneath a borrowed roof, watching Max sleep peacefully for the first time in days, he knew one thing for certain. He hadn't just been given a second chance at life. He'd been reminded of why life was worth living in the first place. It had been a few weeks since the fire. The ashes had settled, and the air no longer smelled like smoke. But for George, everything had changed. The house he once knew was gone, reduced to rubble and memories. But somehow, he didn't feel like he had lost everything. Because the most important thing in his life, the one thing that truly mattered, had survived. Max. They were temporarily living in a small rental a few blocks away. It was quiet, cozy, the kind of place George never would have imagined himself in. But Max didn't mind. He adapted instantly, as dogs do, finding his new favorite nap spot by the window, guarding the front door like it had always been his job. George would catch himself just watching Max sometimes, noticing the little things, the way his ears perked at every noise, the way he gently rested his chin on George's knee during breakfast, the way he looked at him, not just with affection, but with purpose, as if to say, "I've got you. Don't worry." And George believed him. The love of a dog is something hard to explain to people who haven't felt it. It's not flashy. It doesn't come with big declarations or perfect timing. It's in the quiet, in the loyalty, in the way they never leave your side, even when the world burns around you. George began to write again. Short notes, mostly. Thoughts. Reflections. He hadn't written in years, but something about the fire, about what Max had done. It stirred something deep in him. He started with one sentence. "My dog saved my life." Then another. "But really, he's been saving me every day since the day we met." Those words turned into a letter. That letter turned into a story. And soon, his words were shared in a local newsletter, then a website, then even a national outlet that wanted to feature the retired teacher and his heroic golden retriever. George wasn't looking for fame. He didn't want attention. All he wanted was for people to understand. To understand that dogs aren't just animals. They're healers, listeners, companions. Sometimes, they're the only ones who truly see us, flaws, failures, pain and all, and love us anyway. He got hundreds of letters in return. From strangers who had their own Max. From people who had lost their dogs and still felt the ache. From families who rushed out to adopt a dog after reading his story. He read every single one. Max became a symbol, not just of bravery, but of what unconditional love really looks like. And in that quiet rental house, George would sit on the porch again, this time in a borrowed rocking chair, and speak softly to Max about the people they were inspiring. "You did that," he'd say, running a hand through Max's fur. "You saved more lives than just mine." Some days, they'd walk to the edge of town, where the woods began. Max loved those walks. Tail high, nose sniffing the wind, paws crunching on fallen leaves. He walked a little slower now, after the fire. But George never minded. They were in no rush. Every moment together felt like a gift. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the trees, George stopped mid-step. He turned to Max, who was watching the horizon. "You know," he said, "I think I was meant to find you. Or maybe, you were sent to find me." Max looked up, eyes calm, tail swaying. And George smiled. Because in that look, silent, steady, full of knowing, he felt the truth of everything. Max didn't need to speak. He never had. His actions had said it all. "I will stay. I will protect you. I will love you. Always." That's what dogs do. They don't ask for much. A bowl of food, a warm place to sleep, a kind voice. And in return, they give us everything. their trust, their loyalty, their heart. As the stars blinked into the sky and the cool evening breeze whispered through the grass, George reached down and rested his hand on Max's back. No words, no tears, just the quiet comfort of knowing that whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. Because real love, true, unwavering, unconditional love, doesn't end at the edge of disaster. It begins there,